The people everyone fears are sometimes the only ones willing to stand between you and the darkness. I didn't believe that until the night my ordinary life disappeared forever. My name is Claire Bennett, and 6 months ago I thought the biggest challenge in my world was convincing 28 third graders that fractions weren't invented to ruin their childhood. I taught at a small elementary school just outside Boston, lived in a tiny apartment with creaky floors, drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic that rattled whenever it climbed steep hills, and called my parents every Sunday without fail. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Looking back now, I realize ordinary days are precious because you never know which one will quietly become the last. That Thursday had started like every other. Rain tapped softly against my classroom windows while my students painted cardboard rockets for the science fair. The smell of washable paint mixed with fresh crayons filled the room, and laughter echoed down the hallway every time someone accidentally covered their fingers in blue instead of the paper. I remember smiling because Emma, one of my quietest students, finally raised her hand without being afraid of giving the wrong answer. Small victories mattered when you spent your life teaching children. By 5 o'clock the building had emptied, leaving only the humming fluorescent lights and the janitor pushing his cart down the hall. I packed my bag, waved goodbye, and stepped into the cool evening air. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the streetlights like polished glass. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk away, and I welcomed the chance to clear my head before another stack of papers waited on my kitchen table. Halfway home, I noticed a little girl standing alone near the entrance of a neighborhood park. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her blonde curls were damp from the rain, and she hugged a stuffed rabbit so tightly its ears bent against her coat. She kept glancing over her shoulder as though she expected someone to appear. At first I assumed a parent was nearby, but the street felt strangely empty. Then I heard hurried footsteps somewhere behind the row of trees. The little girl's frightened eyes locked onto mine. Without saying a word, she ran straight toward me and grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Her tiny fingers were ice cold. "Please," she whispered, barely louder than the wind, "don't let them take me." My heart skipped. Before I could ask who she meant, a convoy of black SUVs rolled silently around the corner, their headlights washing over the wet pavement. Every vehicle stopped with perfect precision. Doors opened almost at the same time, and several men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the street with calm, disciplined focus instead of panic. Then one final door opened. A tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat emerged from the center vehicle. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply looked directly at the little girl holding my hand, then lifted his eyes to meet mine. In that single silent moment, every instinct told me that the city feared this man for a reason, and somehow fate had just placed me between him and the child who refused to let go. The little girl buried her face against my arm so quickly that I barely had time to breathe. Her small body trembled beneath her pale blue coat, and the stuffed rabbit slipped from her grasp before I caught it with my free hand. The tall man continued walking toward us with measured confidence, every step steady against the rain-soaked sidewalk. Nobody around him spoke. Nobody needed to. The men surrounding him watched every direction without drawing attention to themselves, moving with the quiet discipline of people who had rehearsed danger long before it arrived. I wanted to step backward, but the child tightened her grip. My instincts told me to protect her, even though I had no idea who she was or why she looked so terrified. When the stranger finally stopped a few feet away, his expression remained unreadable. He looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair brushed neatly away from his forehead and gray eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. His tailored overcoat was untouched by the evening drizzle, as though even the weather refused to inconvenience him. He lowered himself just enough to meet the little girl's eyes. "Sophia," he said quietly, "you have frightened everyone." The little girl shook her head so hard that her curls bounced against her cheeks. "I did not want to go with the other man," she whispered. A flicker crossed his face. It disappeared almost instantly, but I caught it. Relief. Genuine relief. He slowly turned his attention toward me. "Did she come to you on her own?" he asked. His voice was calm, controlled, and surprisingly respectful. I nodded before finding my own voice. She ran to me. She looked scared. He glanced briefly toward one of the men standing several yards away. The man gave a nearly invisible nod before speaking into a small earpiece. I did not understand what was happening, but I could feel the tension around us begin to soften. The stranger looked back at me. "Thank you for staying with her." His words surprised me almost as much as his tone. I had expected demands or accusations, not gratitude. Sophia slowly peeked around my side before reaching both arms toward him. He did not rush. Instead, he waited until she moved first, allowing her to decide. She stepped into his embrace, still clutching the stuffed rabbit I handed back to her. He wrapped one arm around her carefully, almost protectively, and for a moment the intimidating figure standing before me looked less like someone people feared and more like a father who had nearly lost something priceless. Then another black SUV stopped sharply across the street. Every man around us reacted at once. Their posture changed, their attention shifting toward the new arrival. The stranger gently guided Sophia behind him without hesitation. He never raised his voice. He never appeared alarmed. Yet the entire atmosphere changed. One of his associates approached quickly and spoke in a voice too low for me to hear. The stranger listened without interrupting. His eyes briefly met mine again, and this time they carried something different. Concern. "Miss Bennett," he said, causing my stomach to tighten because I had never told him my name, "I need you to leave this street immediately." My pulse quickened. "How do you know who I am?" He ignored the question, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder. "Because if someone else saw what just happened," he answered quietly, "your evening is no longer ordinary." His words settled over me with far more weight than they should have. My evening was no longer ordinary. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was overreacting, that I was just an elementary school teacher who had stopped to comfort a frightened little girl. Instead, I found myself looking over my shoulder, suddenly aware of every parked car, every dark window, every stranger walking along the opposite sidewalk. The city I had known my entire life felt unfamiliar in the space of a single minute. "I do not understand," I admitted, trying to steady my breathing. "I have done nothing." The man studied me carefully before answering. "That is exactly why you need to leave." His voice remained composed, almost gentle, but there was an unmistakable urgency beneath it. Sophia reached for his hand, no longer trembling as much as before. She looked back at me with wide blue eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For staying." I smiled despite the confusion twisting inside me. "You are welcome." The stranger opened the rear door of the nearest SUV, helping Sophia climb inside before closing it quietly. He turned back toward me just as I pulled my phone from my purse. "I should probably call the police," I said. "If someone was chasing a child, they need to know." Something changed in his expression. Not anger. Disappointment. "You are free to make that decision," he replied. "But before you do, ask yourself one question." I frowned. "What question?" His gray eyes never left mine. "Did you actually see anyone trying to harm her, or did you only see a frightened child searching for someone she believed she could trust?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. He was right. I had assumed far more than I had witnessed. I had heard footsteps. I had seen fear. Everything else had been my imagination trying to fill in the empty spaces. The realization made me feel strangely vulnerable. "Who are you?" I finally asked. He was silent for several seconds before extending his hand. "Damien Moretti." The name meant nothing to me. At least, not immediately. I shook his hand automatically. His grip was firm without being intimidating, and somehow that made the moment even more unsettling. One of the men nearby quietly cleared his throat. Damien released my hand and looked toward him. "The route has been checked," the man said. Damien nodded once before facing me again. "Miss Bennett, please do not walk home tonight." I blinked in surprise. "It is less than a mile." "Even so." You cannot seriously expect me to climb into one of those vehicles with complete strangers. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. No, he admitted. I would not expect that. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a simple white business card. There was no company logo, no title, only his name and a phone number printed in black letters. If anything feels unusual tonight, call this number immediately. I accepted the card without thinking. Before I could ask another question, a police cruiser rolled slowly past the intersection. Damien glanced toward it but made no effort to leave. The officers continued driving without stopping, as though everything looked perfectly normal. That was when I noticed something that sent an unexpected chill through me. The veteran officer behind the wheel recognized Damien. Their eyes met for only a second before the cruiser continued down the street. No lights. No questions. No curiosity. Just silent recognition. Damien looked back at me one final time. Go home, Claire, he said quietly. And whatever happens next, do not answer your door unless you know exactly who is standing on the other side. I stood on the sidewalk long after the black SUVs disappeared into the evening traffic, turning the plain white business card over between my fingers as though it might explain everything that had just happened. It did not. It was only heavy cardstock with 2 words, Damien Moretti, and a phone number that somehow felt more significant than it should have. By the time I reached my apartment building, I had almost convinced myself the entire encounter had been an elaborate misunderstanding. Children wandered away from their parents every day. Wealthy families hired private security. Maybe that was all this had been. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, unlocked my apartment, and stepped into the familiar comfort of my tiny living room. The old radiator clicked every few seconds. My bookshelf leaned slightly to one side because one leg had been repaired with folded cardboard. A half-finished mug of tea still sat on the coffee table from the night before beside a stack of ungraded math quizzes. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, and I desperately wanted that normalcy to erase the growing uneasiness inside me. I changed into comfortable clothes, reheated leftover vegetable soup, and tried grading papers while soft jazz played through the small speaker in my kitchen. 10 minutes later I realized I had read the same answer sheet 4 times without seeing a single word. My thoughts kept returning to the little girl, to the way Damien had waited for her to choose whether to come to him, and to the strange respect in his voice when he thanked me. None of it matched the image of a dangerous man my imagination had begun creating. I picked up my phone and searched his name. At first, nothing unusual appeared. A few charitable foundations. Several real estate companies. Photographs from fundraising events. Then I found an older newspaper article mentioning the Moretti family among the city's most influential business leaders. The article never accused anyone of wrongdoing, but the comments beneath it painted a very different picture. Some called them generous. Others warned people never to cross them. None of the stories offered proof, only whispers that somehow made me more uncomfortable than facts would have. I locked my phone and laughed softly at myself. I was letting anonymous strangers on the internet frighten me. Just then someone knocked on my apartment door. 3 slow, measured knocks. My smile disappeared instantly. Damien's final warning echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Do not answer your door unless you know exactly who is standing on the other side. I walked quietly toward the entrance and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No neighbors. No delivery driver. No one at all. My heartbeat quickened. I unlocked the deadbolt but kept the security chain fastened before opening the door a few inches. The hallway remained completely silent. Then I noticed a small white envelope resting neatly against my welcome mat. There was no stamp. No address. Only my name written in elegant handwriting. Claire Bennett. I glanced both directions down the hallway before removing the chain and picking it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence printed in the center. We know you found the little girl. My hands turned cold so quickly that I almost dropped it. At that exact moment my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen displayed an unknown number. I stared at it while the ringing continued, remembering the business card still resting in my pocket. For the first time in my life, I was no longer certain that ignoring a phone call was the safest choice. My phone continued vibrating across the kitchen counter while I stood frozen near the front door, the anonymous envelope still trembling in my hand. Every instinct told me to ignore the call, lock every window, and pretend none of this was happening. But another voice, quieter and far more rational, reminded me that someone already knew where I lived. Ignoring reality would not make it disappear. I answered just before the ringing stopped. Hello? There was only silence for a heartbeat. Then I recognized the calm, controlled voice immediately. Claire. Hearing Damien Moretti say my first name somehow made my apartment feel even smaller. How did you get this number? I asked. That is not the question you should be asking. His tone remained steady. Are you alone? I looked around instinctively even though I knew the answer. Yes. Did anyone come to your door? My grip tightened around the envelope. There was a note. He exhaled softly, almost as though he had expected exactly that answer. Do not touch anything else inside it. I looked down at the paper resting on my kitchen counter. Too late. I already opened it. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. Listen carefully. Lock your door if it is not already locked. Turn off every light facing the street. Stay away from the windows. My heartbeat grew louder than his voice. Damien, what is happening? Someone wants to know whether you can be frightened into talking. I frowned. Talking about what? I do not know anything. That may be true, he answered quietly. Unfortunately, they do not know that yet. I walked through my apartment, checking each lock with shaking hands. Every ordinary sound suddenly carried new meaning. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes rattled somewhere inside the walls. A car passed outside, spraying water across the wet pavement. None of it had frightened me yesterday. Tonight every noise made me pause. Should I call the police? I asked. Damien answered immediately. Not yet. His certainty unsettled me. Why not? Because by the time they arrive, whoever left that message will already be gone, and your statement will become public record. I stopped moving. Public record? Your name. Your address. The fact that you encountered Sophia. That information would spread farther than you realize. I leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to slow my breathing. Who would do something like this? People who ask questions before they verify answers. Another silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me all evening. Who exactly are you? This time he did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet honesty I had not expected. I am a man whose family has more enemies than I care to count. Before I could respond, headlights swept across my living room ceiling through the closed blinds. A vehicle had stopped outside my building. I instinctively peeked through the narrow gap between the curtains. A dark sedan sat at the curb with its engine running. I could not see the driver clearly, but I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching my apartment. Damien, I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice, there is a car outside. His response came without hesitation. Step away from the window. I obeyed immediately. How long has it been there? It just arrived. Good, he said. Then we still have time. The certainty in those 5 words chilled me far more than the car itself because they sounded less like hope and more like someone who had seen this exact situation before. My breathing slowed only because Damien's voice remained impossibly calm. Claire, he said, I need you to trust me for the next 5 minutes. I almost laughed at the absurdity of those words. Trust him? I had known this man for less than 2 hours. I did not know where he lived, what he did, or why strangers seemed to recognize his name without speaking it aloud. Yet somehow he sounded more reassuring than anyone else could have at that moment. What do I need to do? I asked. Take only your phone, your wallet, your keys, and a coat. Leave everything else exactly where it is. I looked around my apartment in disbelief. My bookshelf, my family photographs, the framed drawings my students had given me at Christmas, the stack of lesson plans waiting for tomorrow morning. You expect me to leave? Only for tonight. I have work in the morning. Not tomorrow. I closed my eyes. Damien, I cannot simply disappear. You already have, Claire. You just do not know it yet. Before I could argue again, another pair of headlights swept briefly across the living room ceiling before fading away. The sedan outside had not moved. The silence inside my apartment felt heavier with every passing second. I hurried into my bedroom, pulled a small overnight bag from the closet, then stopped. His instructions echoed in my mind. Take only your phone, your wallet, your keys, and a coat. Nothing else. It felt wrong leaving everything behind, but something deep inside me whispered that this was no longer a situation where I could rely on ordinary instincts. I slipped my wallet into my coat pocket and grabbed my keys. I am ready, I whispered into the phone. Good. Walk into the hallway but do not use the elevator. How do you know I have an elevator? Another brief silence. Because I know your building. The answer should have frightened me. Instead, it somehow made me feel less alone. I locked my apartment door and stepped quietly into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything looked exactly as it had every evening for the past 4 years. Mrs. Henderson's welcome wreath still hung across the hall. Someone had left a bicycle beside the stairwell. Life continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Take the stairs to the rear exit, Damien instructed. Do not look toward the front parking lot. I followed every direction without question. My footsteps echoed softly against the concrete staircase as I descended floor after floor. When I reached the rear entrance, I hesitated with my hand on the push bar. What if someone is outside? I asked. Open the door. I pushed it slowly. Cool night air brushed against my face. The narrow alley behind the building was empty except for a dark blue delivery van parked beside the dumpsters. A middle-aged man wearing a brown maintenance jacket climbed out holding a toolbox. He smiled politely, looking exactly like someone repairing broken plumbing after hours. Miss Bennett? He asked. I nodded cautiously. Your furnace inspection, he said with a completely ordinary smile. Before I could answer, his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward my phone. Mr. Moretti asked me to remind you that winter arrives early in Boston. The strange sentence made no sense until Damien spoke quietly through the phone. Get into the van, Claire. He works for me. I stared at the friendly stranger, then back toward the quiet alley where nothing appeared dangerous at all. For the first time in my life, safety no longer looked like flashing police lights or familiar neighbors. It looked like an unmarked delivery van driven by a man whose real name I would probably never know. The man opened the passenger door before I had fully made up my mind. Please, he said with a calm smile, we should not stay here any longer than necessary. His voice carried none of the urgency I felt, yet I noticed he kept scanning the alley without turning his head very much. I climbed into the van, closed the door, and immediately heard the automatic lock engage with a soft click. The interior smelled faintly of fresh coffee and clean fabric instead of engine oil. Shelves lined the back of the van, filled with ordinary maintenance supplies that made the entire vehicle look completely forgettable. If someone passed us on the street, they would never look twice. The driver started the engine and eased onto the road without attracting attention. My phone was still pressed against my ear. I am in the van, I whispered. I know, Damien replied. You are safe for the moment. For the moment. Those 4 words stayed with me as the familiar streets of my neighborhood slipped past the windows. We drove through intersections I recognized, past the grocery store where I bought fresh fruit every Saturday morning and the small bakery that always gave teachers a discount. Everything outside looked exactly the same, but I felt as though I were seeing my own city from the wrong side of a mirror. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere no one will think to look tonight," Damien answered. "How long will I have to stay?" "I do not know yet." I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. Less than 3 hours earlier my biggest concern had been grading spelling tests before Friday. Now I was riding through Boston in an unmarked van with strangers because someone had slipped an anonymous message under my apartment door. Nothing about my life made sense anymore. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the driver turned through an iron gate that opened automatically. We followed a winding driveway lined with towering maple trees whose leaves shimmered beneath soft landscape lighting. Ahead stood a large stone estate overlooking a quiet lake. It was elegant without being extravagant, surrounded by gardens instead of high walls. Somehow that surprised me more than anything else. I had expected cold concrete, armed guards, and something that looked more like a fortress than a home. The front door opened before the van came to a complete stop. Damien stood beneath the warm porch lights wearing the same charcoal overcoat, though his tie was gone and the top button of his white shirt had been loosened. He looked less intimidating than before, but somehow more tired. As I stepped onto the stone walkway, he studied my face carefully, almost as though making certain I had not been harmed during the drive. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I folded my arms across my chest. I did not exactly have many choices. He accepted the criticism without arguing. "No," he admitted. "You did not." For several seconds neither of us spoke. The silence was interrupted by the front door swinging open again. A blur of blonde curls rushed across the polished floor. "Miss Claire." Sophia called happily before throwing her small arms around my waist. I froze in surprise before instinctively hugging her back. She looked completely different from the frightened child I had met earlier. Her cheeks were rosy, her stuffed rabbit tucked safely beneath one arm, and she smiled with the uncomplicated joy only children seemed capable of finding after difficult days. Damien watched quietly from a few feet away. His expression softened so naturally that I almost questioned whether this was the same man who had commanded an entire convoy with nothing more than a glance. It was the first time I saw something far more powerful than authority. I saw a father whose entire world seemed to breathe easier simply because his daughter was smiling again. Sophia refused to let go of my hand as she led me through the front hallway as though we had known each other for years instead of hours. The house felt surprisingly warm, filled with soft lighting, polished wood floors, and shelves crowded with books rather than expensive decorations meant only to impress visitors. Family photographs rested on side tables beside fresh flowers, and somewhere deeper inside the house I caught the unmistakable smell of homemade tomato soup simmering in the kitchen. None of it matched the image I had built in my mind while driving there. I had expected cold marble, endless security cameras, and silence. Instead I found a home where someone had left colored pencils scattered across a coffee table beside an unfinished children's puzzle. Sophia pulled me into a bright sitting room overlooking the lake. "I was coloring before I went outside," she explained proudly, climbing onto a large chair. "Daddy told me not to leave the garden, but I saw my bunny blow away in the wind." Damien appeared in the doorway a moment later. His expression remained composed, but I noticed the brief look Sophia gave him before lowering her eyes. She already knew she had broken an important rule. He walked over slowly and knelt beside her chair. "Do you remember why we stay inside the gates?" he asked gently. She nodded without looking at him. "Because you want me safe." "Exactly." There was no anger in his voice, only relief that she was sitting safely in front of him. Sophia reached over and wrapped one small arm around his neck. "I am sorry, Daddy." He kissed the top of her head before standing again. The entire conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it revealed more about Damien than anything else I had witnessed. He did not control people with fear inside these walls. He protected them with patience. A woman in her late 50s entered carrying a tray with grilled cheese sandwiches and steaming bowls of soup. She smiled kindly at me. "You must be Claire." "I am Margaret." She spoke with the relaxed confidence of someone who had worked here for many years. You look like you could use something warm. I had not realized how hungry I was until the rich aroma reached me. Thank you, I said quietly. Margaret gave Damien an amused look. She thanks people, unlike certain gentlemen I could mention. For the first time since meeting him, I saw Damien smile without restraint. It was small, but genuine enough to soften the sharp lines of his face. I thanked her earlier, he replied. Once, Margaret answered. You still have room for improvement. She disappeared toward the kitchen before he could respond. I looked at Damien in surprise. She talks to you like that? She has known me since I was younger than Sophia, he said simply. She earned the right many years ago. We sat at the dining table while Sophia happily explained every detail of her latest school art project. She spoke so quickly that she occasionally forgot to breathe between sentences. Damien listened to every word without checking his phone, interrupting only to ask thoughtful questions about her drawings and favorite books. He noticed when she spilled a few drops of soup on the tablecloth and quietly handed her a napkin without embarrassment. Watching them together unsettled me in a way I could not explain. The stories whispered online had painted Damien Moretti as a man defined by power and fear. Yet the person sitting across from me looked more concerned about whether his daughter finished her vegetables than about whatever dangerous world waited outside the gates. For the first time since this impossible night had begun, I found myself wondering whether the most frightening thing about Damien was not who he really was, but how little anyone outside this house truly knew about him. After dinner, Margaret insisted that Sophia prepare for bed, and the little girl reluctantly hugged me before disappearing upstairs with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. Her laughter slowly faded into the second-floor hallway, leaving an unexpected quiet behind. I stood beside the wide living room windows overlooking the lake, watching moonlight ripple across the water. It was difficult to believe that somewhere beyond those peaceful trees, strangers knew my name and my address. Damien entered carrying 2 steaming mugs. Chamomile tea, he said, placing one on the table beside me. Margaret believes it solves almost everything. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic cup. Does it? He looked toward the lake before answering. Sometimes believing something helps is enough. We stood in comfortable silence for several moments. It was the first silence that evening that did not feel frightening. Finally I turned toward him. Will you tell me the truth now? His expression remained calm. Which truth? All of it. He nodded once, as though he had expected the question from the beginning. The note left outside your apartment was not random. Someone learned that Sophia approached you before my security team reached her. They do not know what you heard or what you know. They only know you were there. But I truly know nothing. I believe you. He spoke without hesitation. Unfortunately, belief and certainty are not always the same thing. I looked down at the untouched tea in my hands. You could have ignored me tonight. You could have protected your own family and left me to deal with this alone. Damien's eyes settled on me with quiet intensity. No. The answer came so quickly that it caught me off guard. Why? He walked to the fireplace, resting one hand against the carved wooden mantel. Because my daughter trusted you before she trusted anyone else that evening. He paused briefly before continuing. She ran toward kindness. I refused to punish someone for that. Those words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. They sounded nothing like the ruthless businessman described in whispered rumors. They sounded like a father trying to preserve the one quality he feared the world might take from his child. A soft knock interrupted us. One of the security staff stepped inside carrying a tablet. Sir, we reviewed the building cameras near Miss Bennett's apartment. Damien accepted the device without speaking. His eyes moved carefully across the screen. I could not see the images, but I noticed the muscles along his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. What is it? I asked. He remained silent for another moment before handing the tablet back. Thank you, Daniel. Continue with the overnight plan. The man nodded respectfully and left. I waited until the door closed. Please do not tell me everything is fine if it is not. Damien looked directly at me. Someone entered your apartment building nearly an hour before you arrived home. A chill spread through my chest. The envelope? Likely. So they knew where I lived before tonight? Yes. I struggled to process the answer. Then why wait? Damien folded his arms thoughtfully. Because whoever planned this wanted you frightened, not harmed. Fear makes people predictable. I slowly sat down in the nearest chair, trying to absorb everything. And now? He walked toward the window, looking out into the darkness beyond the gardens. Now they know you are no longer where they expected you to be. Just as he finished speaking, every exterior light surrounding the lake illuminated at once, washing the property in brilliant white. Somewhere outside, a motion sensor had been triggered. The house remained perfectly calm, but every member of the security team instantly became visible through the windows, moving with quiet precision as though they had rehearsed this exact moment countless times before. No alarms sounded. No voices shouted across the property. The professionalism surrounding the house made the silence feel even more unsettling. From where I stood, I watched several members of the security team reposition themselves with calm efficiency, communicating through subtle gestures instead of panic. Damien remained beside the window, his posture unchanged. If he was worried, he refused to let it control him. What happened? I asked quietly. He kept his eyes on the gardens for another few seconds before answering. A deer crossed the outer sensor. I blinked. That is all? He finally turned toward me with the faintest hint of amusement. Most security systems fail because people stop paying attention after too many false alarms. Mine works because everyone responds the same way every time. I released a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. I do not think my heart can survive many more evenings like this. His expression softened. I am hoping this is your last one. Before I could reply, Margaret appeared carrying a folded blanket over one arm. You two have spent enough time frightening each other for one night, she declared. Claire, your room is ready. I hesitated. I really do not want to impose. You are not, she answered warmly. Besides, Sophia would never forgive us if you disappeared before breakfast. The thought made me smile despite everything that had happened. Margaret led me upstairs to a comfortable guest room overlooking the lake. It was simple, elegant, and surprisingly personal. A vase of fresh flowers rested on the dresser, and a small reading lamp cast a warm glow across a neatly made bed. Nothing about the room felt temporary. It felt welcoming. If you need anything, just ask, Margaret said before leaving me alone. I closed the door gently behind her and finally allowed myself to sit on the edge of the bed. The silence inside the room was almost overwhelming. I removed my phone from my pocket and stared at the dark screen. There were 6 missed calls from the school principal, several messages from coworkers asking why I had not answered, and one voicemail from my mother reminding me to call when I had time. I wanted nothing more than to hear her voice, but how could I explain any of this without placing her into the same uncertainty that now surrounded me? I typed a short message instead, telling her I had unexpectedly stayed with friends for the night and would call in the morning. It was the first lie I had ever told my parents. Somehow that hurt more than leaving my apartment behind. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Damien stood outside the partially open door, still wearing the same white shirt, though he had replaced the overcoat with a dark sweater that made him look less like an untouchable businessman and more like an ordinary man who had forgotten to sleep. I wanted to let you know that your principal has already been informed you will not be at school tomorrow, he said. I looked at him in surprise. You called my school? Only to say there was a family emergency. I sighed. You seem to know how to solve problems before I even realize they exist. He gave a quiet smile that never quite reached his eyes. Experience teaches strange lessons. I studied him for a moment before asking the question that had been quietly growing inside me all evening. When was the last time you had an ordinary day? He looked past me toward the softly lit room, considering the answer far longer than I expected. Finally he spoke in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the hallway. I honestly cannot remember. For the first time since meeting Damien Moretti, I realized something unexpected. I was not the only person whose normal life had disappeared. The difference was that mine had vanished only a few hours ago, while his seemed to have been gone for many years. Sleep never truly came that night. I drifted in and out of restless dreams until pale morning light slipped through the curtains and painted soft golden lines across the hardwood floor. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot where I was. Then everything returned at once. The envelope. The phone call. Damien. Sophia. I dressed in the same clothes I had worn the evening before and quietly stepped into the hallway. The house was already awake. Somewhere downstairs I heard dishes clinking together and the faint sound of a child laughing. The normal rhythm of family life felt strangely comforting after a night filled with uncertainty. I followed the voices into the kitchen where Margaret stood flipping pancakes while Sophia sat at the island carefully arranging blueberries into the shape of a smiling face. Damien stood near the coffee machine reading several printed reports. He looked as though he had not slept at all. "Good morning," Sophia said brightly. "Daddy said you would still be here." I smiled despite the heaviness in my chest. "Good morning." Margaret slid a plate toward me without asking whether I was hungry. "Nobody solves problems on an empty stomach," she declared. Damien folded the papers and placed them neatly beside his coffee. "Did you rest?" he asked. I gave him an honest answer. "Not very well." "Neither did I." It was such a simple admission that it caught me off guard. Powerful people were supposed to appear untouchable. Damien never pretended to be. As breakfast continued, Sophia proudly explained that she had a spelling quiz later that week. Instinctively I began helping her sound out several difficult words. Within minutes she was giggling every time she correctly pronounced another one. Damien watched quietly from across the table. When Sophia hurried upstairs to brush her teeth, the room grew noticeably quieter. Damien finally slid the folded reports toward me. "You deserve to know why I asked you here." I looked down at several printed photographs taken from security cameras. One showed the hallway outside my apartment only minutes before I arrived home. Another captured the anonymous envelope being placed outside my door by someone wearing a baseball cap pulled low over their face. The final image showed the same person leaving the building moments later and climbing into a vehicle with its license plate intentionally obscured. "They planned everything," I whispered. Damien nodded. "Long before Sophia met you." I looked back at him. "So this was never really about me?" "No," he answered quietly. "You became involved because you showed kindness to the wrong child at the wrong moment." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the unfairness of those words. Kindness should not change someone's life. "I agree." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug without taking a sip. "Unfortunately, the world does not always reward decent people fairly." Before either of us spoke again, Daniel entered the kitchen with unusual urgency. He remained calm, but I noticed the way he handed Damien a sealed envelope instead of speaking openly. Damien read the single sheet inside, his expression becoming impossibly still. He folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket. "Has something happened?" I asked. He met my eyes with the same honesty he had shown all morning. "Your school received flowers 30 minutes ago." My heart skipped. "Flowers?" "Yes." "From who?" His answer came so softly that it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the coffee machine. There was no name on the card. Only one sentence. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What did it say?" Damien held my gaze without looking away. "We know where the teacher is now." The words settled over the breakfast table with a silence so complete that even Sophia looked up from her coloring book. She could not have understood the meaning behind them, but children always sensed when adults suddenly stopped pretending everything was fine. Damien offered her a reassuring smile. "Why do not you help Margaret water the flowers in the sunroom?" he asked gently. Sophia nodded happily and skipped away without another question. Only after the kitchen door closed behind her did Damien allow the smile to disappear. I stared at him, struggling to understand how strangers could have found me so quickly. "I never told anyone I was here," I whispered. "Neither did I." His answer came without hesitation. Daniel stepped forward and quietly placed another folder on the table. "We reviewed every vehicle near the school before the delivery arrived," he explained. Nothing unusual appeared. Whoever arranged the flowers stayed several steps removed. Damien opened the folder, scanning each page with practiced patience. "They are sending messages instead of making demands," he said thoughtfully. "That means they are still searching for information." I folded my hands together, trying to steady the nervous energy building inside me. "Then maybe I should leave." Both men looked at me. "If I disappear from your life, maybe they will stop following you." Damien slowly shook his head. "That would only make you easier to reach." "But I am putting your family at risk." He leaned forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Claire, my family has lived with risk for years. You did not bring danger into this house. You happened to cross paths with it." His words should have comforted me, yet guilt continued pressing against my chest. I had spent my career teaching children to solve problems by taking responsibility for their choices. Walking away now felt like the responsible thing to do. "You are still thinking about leaving," Damien observed quietly. I looked down at my untouched coffee. "Would not you?" He surprised me by answering honestly. "Yes." I looked back up. "Then why are you asking me to stay?" He remained silent for a moment before speaking with a sincerity I had not heard before. "Because sometimes the safest decision and the easiest decision are not the same." Before I could respond, Margaret entered carrying a tray of fresh muffins as though nothing unusual had happened. She looked from Damien to me, immediately sensing the tension. "Whatever decision you are making," she said gently, "do not make it while you are afraid. Fear is an impatient advisor." She set the tray down and quietly left us alone again. Her words lingered in the room. I realized that every person in this house carried an unusual kind of calm. Not because they believed difficult moments would never come, but because they had learned not to surrender their judgment to them. Damien finally stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the gardens. Bright morning sunlight reflected across the lake, making the estate appear peaceful enough to belong on a postcard instead of inside the strange reality I had entered. "There is something else you deserve to know," he said without turning around. "Sophia did not run to you by accident." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He faced me again, his gray eyes unusually thoughtful. "After everything was over, she told Margaret why she chose you." I waited quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. "She said you looked like someone who helped children before asking questions." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Of every explanation I had imagined, that was the one I never expected. Damien lowered his voice. "She trusted your kindness before she knew your name." I felt tears threaten for the first time since this impossible journey had begun. Not because I was frightened anymore, but because I suddenly understood what Damien had been protecting all along. It was not only his daughter. It was her ability to believe that kind people still existed in the world. 3 weeks passed before I returned to my classroom. The police never found the person who delivered the anonymous flowers, and no one ever claimed responsibility for the notes left behind. Gradually the messages stopped, not because the world had become safer, but because whoever had been watching finally understood there was nothing to gain from following an elementary school teacher who truly knew nothing. My apartment remained exactly as I had left it, although it no longer felt quite the same. Some places change forever simply because you remember who you were before walking through the door. On my first morning back at school, my students greeted me with handmade welcome cards covered in crooked hearts, glitter, and misspelled words. Emma proudly handed me a drawing of our classroom beneath a bright blue sky. Across the top she had written, "Teachers make people feel safe." I thanked her with a smile, but the words stayed with me all day. That afternoon, as the final school bus disappeared around the corner, a familiar black SUV waited quietly across the street. It did not pull into the parking lot. It did not attract attention. It simply remained there until every child had gone home. Damien stepped out only after the sidewalks had emptied. He wore a navy jacket instead of the formal suits I had first seen him wearing, and for the first time he looked almost anonymous among the parents walking to their cars. "How was your first day back?" he asked. Loud, I answered with a laugh. Children have a remarkable talent for making ordinary life feel extraordinary. A faint smile crossed his face. "I have noticed." We began walking slowly along the sidewalk beneath rows of maple trees already beginning to change color. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. It no longer felt uncomfortable. "Sophia misses you," he said after a while. "She asks whether her teacher friend is coming back." I smiled at the thought. "Tell her I still expect her to practice her spelling words. She will be disappointed to hear there are homework assignments. She will survive." We both laughed quietly. It was a simple moment, almost impossible to imagine after the fear of that first night. When we reached my apartment building, Damien stopped beside the entrance. "Everything has been quiet," he said. "I expect it will stay that way." I studied him carefully. "And what about you?" He looked toward the fading sunset before answering. "My world rarely stays quiet for long." There was no self-pity in his voice. Only acceptance. I realized then that he had never asked for sympathy. He had only wanted to protect the people standing closest to him. Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a child's drawing. Sophia had sketched 3 figures holding hands beneath an oversized sun. One figure wore a blue dress. Another held a stuffed rabbit. The tallest stood between them with a smile that was much larger than the one Damien usually allowed himself to wear. Across the top, written in careful block letters, were the words, "My safe people." I looked up, unable to speak for a moment. Damien simply nodded once before walking back toward the waiting SUV. I watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the intersection, carrying with it the man the city might never fully understand. People often believe courage belongs to those who are never afraid. They are wrong. Courage belongs to the people who choose kindness anyway, even when fear would be easier. I met a man the world had already judged, and I discovered that the strongest walls are not built from power. They are built by those who quietly stand between innocent people and the darkness without ever asking for recognition.